Morning, Lismore Church. Nice to be back with you again. I've had a weekend off last weekend. Actually, I had right off until Wednesday off. So I feel like I've missed you guys, but it's nice to be back with you again today. Today is going to be part 5 in the series of the covenantal name, the Son of God. Now, it's going to be hard for us to remember looking back to the first session, so I want to give you a very quick overview of what we've come to the conclusion of already. We started in this verse in 1 John chapter 5 and verse 13 that says, "These things I have said to you for those who believe in the name of the Son of God, so that you can know that you are saved." And we looked at this and said, well, there must be something significant in the name Son of God, because there's a number of names that are given to Jesus. We won't go through all of them this morning, but certainly that name, Son of God, has some significance. And we looked at this and said, well, is it a chronological name? Does it mean that Jesus emanated from the Father at one stage? And clearly the other verses around the Bible says that Jesus was always in existence, and John's going to reveal that today, that he was with God even before the foundation of the world. So we're going to have a look at that. And if it doesn't mean in a chronological sense, then what does it mean? And we've discovered that it actually has a lot to do with the covenant that God made in the very beginning. In the beginning, we have Adam, who was called the Son of God. And in chapter 1 and verse 28, it tells us that Adam was told to be fruitful and multiply and fill the whole earth. To fill the whole earth and subdue it, to bring it under control. Why did he need to fill the whole earth and subdue it? Because the devil was there on the earth as well. They were in their bubble in the Garden of Eden, but the devil could go into one tree in that Garden of Eden. But by resisting the devil and having children as sons of God, Adam would grow the Garden of Eden until it filled the whole earth and subdued it. How did he go with that role, by the way? Those who said he went very good, put up your hands. We've got no hands up. So he didn't do too well, did he? And we find in the very first promise in Genesis 3 and verse 15, the promise was that through your seed, Eve, that someone would come. Another Son of God would actually come. Another Son of God to replace Adam. And we're going to see how Paul brings that out in Romans and Corinthians today, that this second Son, this promised Son, was to replace what Adam failed to do. And this seed was going to be Jesus Christ. We've looked at that, and we've seen through the Old Testament the journey that we've been on, how different people were called the Son of God. We found the nation of Israel were called God's firstborn son, his only begotten son. We saw how King David was called the Son of God, how Solomon was also called the Son of God, and when Jesus came, God announced it from heaven that Jesus was the Son of God. And I want us to look at this section today, because today we're going to finish off our series. Tony actually asked me where we're going to finish off the series. He thinks I've still got a little bit to go. He thinks that maybe I might need another one, but I told him no, we're going to finish off the series today. But he said it's okay if we need another one. But we'll see how that goes, Tony. I'll see if we've got him across the line after this one. But today I want us to see that the Son of God is the second Son who came to restore you and I to our true identity. The true identity that we were created in. We were created to be sons of God. And Jesus came back to restore that identity in us. How many people know where this place is? Put up your hand. I was there last weekend. It's Port Macquarie. In the picture on your left there, you can see that there's a walkway out to the end. There's a break wall out to the end. And on the rocks on the left-hand side are all painted. And if you look closely at this rock on the right-hand side, on the next one down, you might actually see, I don't know if you can see in there, but there's a name Merritt there as well. But back in 2009, the Christmas of 2009-2010, a few of this Miller clan, which now I've been adopted into because I've married a MacDonald who part of was a Miller. Through this clan, I actually become part of that family, and we decided to paint a rock. Now, to paint a rock down there, you have to find one that hasn't been painted before. And let me tell you, that's not a simple task, because just about every single rock is painted. And the rock that we found was actually painted on the top, but not on the side. But what people would do is, if they come across a rock that was as old as, say, that one in the top right-hand corner, they might go, that's probably old and forgotten about, we might paint over that. So while we were there this weekend, for my wife's 50th, by the way, we were celebrating her 50th birthday. Happy birthday, Cherie. I'll get in trouble for that later. But while we were there, we said, let's repaint this rock. Let's restore this rock, because if we don't restore it back to its original position, we could lose it. Someone else will say, that's an old rock, it's been forgotten about, we're going to put our logo on top of it. So we said, let's do that while we're here. We chose the very last day, and there was a few showers going around, and we were a little bit worried, but we finally got it done just before we left. So it has been restored, and hopefully that will guarantee that it will stay there for another 10 years. But today I want to look about that restoration. Did the rock restore itself? No, it had to have someone else to come and restore that rock for it. But I want to talk about Jesus coming and restoring us. We've been looking at the Son of God, how the Old Testament writers understood the Son of God. The Old Testament writers understood the Son of God, that he was the covenanted Son to come. He was the promised Son to come. He was in a line of succession of sons of God. And the New Testament, we find, picked up exactly where the Old Testament left off. It began in that very first story in the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, where Jesus said to Adam when he failed, don't worry, I'm going to give you a seed that will succeed in restoring mankind back to the image of God, restoring mankind back to true sons and daughters of God. So we've been looking at that journey, and certainly in Matthew that we looked at last time, Matthew and Luke, we saw that Matthew refers to Jesus as who? The son of David and the son of Abraham. For two reasons. He was the son of Abraham because he was the son of many, and he was the son of Abraham because he was the son of the beloved. He was the king, in the kingly line. And we find that Luke went further back from that. He went back to Jesus being the son of Adam, who was the Son of God. So revealed that although Adam was the Son of God, Jesus was the Son of God in that respect. But certainly those New Testament writers, when they talked about the Son of God coming through humanity, they didn't think of Jesus in the chronological sense. Because certainly Matthew, he said that even though he was the son of Joseph, he was actually not the son of Joseph, because Joseph had nothing to do with it. So he was telling us that Jesus came in a relational sense, not in a chronological sense. And often when we look at this name for the Son of God, we think of it in a chronological sense. But it's not that. It's so much more than that. So I want us to open our Bibles this morning to the Gospel of John. Like I said earlier, we're going to look at the Gospel of John. We're going to look at a section in Romans, and we're going to touch on a section in Corinthians. John chapter 1. We're going to look at how John introduces Jesus. I love the Gospel of John, one of my favourite Gospels. After Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. John chapter 1 and verse 1. And it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was." Word was God. So who's the Word? God. But is he really God? Because he's with God. It's a bit confusing, isn't it? So we find that if we read on, we see that he was in the beginning with God, and verse 3 tells us all things that were made through him. Without him, nothing was made that was made. So in other words, out of all the things that were made, everything was made through him. There was nothing that was made that wasn't made through the Word. By the way, who's the Word? God? Jesus. Is it God or is it Jesus? It tells us in verse 14 that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The only one who was God that became flesh and dwelt among us was Jesus. Yeah. So I love the way that John starts his gospel. John doesn't say, and the Father had a son, or then the Father was with the Son. He actually says God was with God. And God became flesh and dwelt among us. He was saying before Jesus became Jesus, he was actually God. And it tells us that the unmade joined the made. So here we have God now becoming Jesus and becoming part of a made world that he actually made. Let's see how John puts that in verse 10, chapter 1, verse 10. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. So he was in this world that he made, and the subjects that he made didn't know him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them gave the right to become what? Children of God. In other words, sons of God. To those who believed in his name. Believed in his name. So what this is telling us is that there's a new beginning. John starts his gospel by saying there's a new beginning. And he starts it exactly the way we find Genesis chapter 1 that starts. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The word for God there is the plural, the three parts of the Godhead. So we find that in the beginning, God created. Now we find a new creation. And this new creation is so then what? We can be sons or children of God. Why did we have to have that chance again? Because we were created to be children of God. But we find that Adam, after he sinned, that he then had sons and daughters after his own image. No longer sons and daughters of God. So Jesus came down to set things right, to make a new creation so we can become sons and daughters of God again. And this new creation is going to be through the Word, through Jesus who became flesh. And it's very interesting here that John says, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. This new beginning is a new birth. He goes into a lot more detail in John chapter 3 about this new birth to Nicodemus. Nicodemus, being a Pharisee, should have understood these things, but Nicodemus was struggling with this new birth idea. The reason why he was struggling with this new birth idea is because he was thinking of it in a chronological sense. He's saying, how can I go back into my mother's womb and be born again? That's just weird, Jesus. He says, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a birth that involves water and the Spirit. So this new birth experience will enable us to be sons and daughters of God. Let's notice verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. Now, John uses this word glory a lot to reveal Jesus' character, who he truly is. In other words, he is in the express image of God. He has a perfect character. We beheld his glory, his character, the glory or the character as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And this is where people get mucked up. They find this only begotten word and they go, there you go, he is the only begotten of the Father. He's the only one that's emanated out of the Father or been born of the Father. Is it really saying that? No, definitely not. It is not saying that because so many other places we've realised that people have been called the only begotten. We found that Isaac himself was the only begotten. You know, when we look at history, when there was a covenantal son, the promised son that was going to be in that line that Jesus was going to be born, in their minds it was always the firstborn son. That's why we find when Isaac had twins and Esau came out first, he was desperate to give the blessing to Esau because he was the firstborn. That's why we find Abraham, when he was told that he was going to have another son through whom Jesus was going to come, and this son would be through his wife Sarah, he pleads with God and says, why not Ishmael? Because Ishmael is my firstborn son. He's my only begotten son. But we find when we come to Hebrews that the only begotten is not the firstborn. We find it's got nothing to do with a chronological birth. It has to do with a birth as a new Son of God, as a covenantal Son of God. And we find that Jacob was the one. We find that Isaac, although he wasn't the firstborn, was the son of promise. And Hebrews tells us he was the only begotten son. Not in a chronological sense, but he was the only begotten covenantal Son of God. He was the only one through who the promise was going to come. So when John says here, and he says it also in John 3:16, he says the only begotten Son of God, what he's actually saying is the only one that is the true Son that can restore yours and my sonship. He is the only one, since Adam lost that identity, that could be the true Son of God that was going to restore us to sons and daughters of God. Is that good news? Fantastic. I love that. It is fantastic because what John is telling us is there's an opportunity for a new creation. A new creation, and it's through the promised Son that was to come. Let's now go and have a look at Romans chapter 1. Let's see how Paul explains it. Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1 and verse 1. And it says here, Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, called to be, I love that, called to be, an apostle separated to the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. In other words, Paul is saying also, this is the promise that was made way back in the beginning, and it goes all the way through the Scriptures. I was having a Bible study this morning and showing how the whole of the Bible hinges and grows from that very first beginning story. And he says, this was foretold in the prophets in the Holy Scriptures concerning his Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who was born of the seed of David according to the flesh, and declared to be the Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection of the dead. Here Paul tells us that he was declared. He was declared, or as some other versions might say, he was appointed. In other words, this was a role that Jesus took on. He took on this sonship role in the place of Adam. He was declared. He came in the lineage of David. He was declared to be the son of David. Because of why? Because of the resurrection of the dead. Here is telling us he was declared because of his lineage. Because he's fulfilled the promise that was given way back then. He fulfilled everything he was meant to do, so he must be the true Son of God. He was successful in fulfilling the covenant promise. In other words, what Paul is saying, his character lined up with his lineage. He was that true promised son. Let's go over and see how he talks about it in chapter 5. Romans chapter 5 and verse 12. Romans chapter 5 and verse 12. Notice how it says, "Therefore, just through one man's sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned." I'm glad Paul doesn't stop there, because that really gives us no hope at all, doesn't it? It's saying Adam was meant to produce sons of God, but because of his sin, he now produces sinful people. So we're all in this place of being sinful. It's to all, it's spread to all, because all have sinned. Verse 14, "Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned according to the likeness or of the transgression of Adam, who is a type of him who was to come." So this here is telling us that despite we didn't do the exact same thing as Adam, we've all sinned, we've all fallen short, we're all in that same likeness, and we're all heading to death. But what? But this person that's to come was a type of him who is. That word "is" has been actually put in there. I believe it should be "was." Who was a type of him to come. This Jesus who was to come was the second Adam. Was Adam in his original state before his sinful nature. He was in a body degraded by sin, but he was that second Adam who could fulfill what Adam couldn't. Let's go down to verse 18. In verse 18 it says, "Therefore, as through one man's offence judgment came to all men, resulting in condemnation, even so, though through one man's righteous act the free gift came to all men, resulting in justification of life." What Paul is telling us, yes, we did get this inheritance from Adam. We did have this sinful nature from Adam. We are no longer in the perfect image of God. But what he's telling us is that through Jesus, we can have that restored. Through this second Adam, that can be restored. And that's really good news, because in the next verse it tells us in verse 19, "For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so also by one man's obedience many will be made righteous." Many will be made righteous. What Paul here is telling us, there's two lineages. There's two groups of people, which lines up with our very first story. In our very first story, the promise was given after Adam and Eve sinned that there will be enmity between the seed of the serpent, the devil, and the seed of the woman, God's people. There was going to be enmity between the two. There was going to be this war between the two. And we find that when Jesus was on this earth, he actually told the leaders of the church then, at the point of time when they were trying to crucify him, he said that you are of your father the devil, and you do what the devil wants you to do. Two lineages. He says we get this lineage from Adam, we get this other lineage from Jesus, the second Adam. who has come to restore Israel. And he talks about it as the fleshly image and the spiritual image. One's led by the Spirit, one's led by the flesh. What's that mean? Led by our own evil desires. You know, all sin, I believe, and I mentioned this morning to Levi, all sin can be attributed to self-worship or selfishness. That's why we've got our theme song today, less of me, less of this selfishness, less of this self-centeredness that leads to sin, and more of Jesus, more to be filled by his Spirit. So Paul uses this argument of the flesh and the Spirit not to say that our bodies change from being a physical fleshly body to a spiritual body and we're only spirits. He's not saying that. He's actually saying that we're either led by the fleshly self or we're led by God's Spirit. And the whole context of what he has to say, he says that so much. And what it says in chapter 6, in relation to what it was said in chapter 5, that we have this new lineage, that we have this restoration through Jesus. He says in verse 1, what shall we say then? Shall we continue to sin so that grace must abound? Does it now matter what we do? Of course it does, he says. Of course it does. And then he tells us in verse 3, do you not know that as many of you who were baptized into Christ were baptized into his death? As many of you who were baptized into Christ were baptized into his death. Therefore you were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so you should walk in newness of life. So Paul uses the analogy of baptism. Baptism is a dying to your old life of sin, this fleshly, lustly, self-centered person that was inside me. He said, you've got to die to that and raise to a new life in Jesus Christ. He has enabled that through his death. He has made us right with him. So this baptism is a dying to that old life. It's a raising to a new life in Jesus. And I love how it says it in verse 5. In verse 5 it says, for if we have been united together in the likeness of his death, certainly we also shall be in the likeness of his resurrection. You know, there's a word here that's only used once in the entire Bible. Does anyone have a clue as to what it is? Did I hear that word? Where's Emily? What was that word, Emily? I told the young people I was going to use a word this morning in their Sabbath school class. And it comes from this word, united together. If you've got a King James version, it'll say planted together. Has anyone got a different version than that in verse 5 for united together or planted together? The Greek word is a real unique word. Symphotus, something like that. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right now. I had that off pat this morning. But it's a Greek word it's a unique word that's only used once in the entire scriptures. And it's a Greek word for actually planting two seeds side by side together. It's a Greek word. What happens with a seed? How do you have to plant a seed? They have to die first, don't they? So there's a death of the seeds, and you put them together, and what grows out is a new plant, a new seed. And this word, and I'm not going to try and say it again, this word of this uniting together or planting together, it's the two plants when they grow up, you intertwine them together. I wish this word was used more in the Bible, but this is the only place it's used. And Paul uses it with this analogy of baptism as what happens when we die to our old life. We actually concentrate and focus on growing with Christ. intertwining ourselves with Christ, and in that way we become a new person, a new being, a new being. And Paul tells us when this happens in Romans 8 and verse 1, therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. We're a new person. We're now sons and daughters of God. And in Romans 8 and verse 14, it says, therefore, as many who are led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God. So we need to be led by the Spirit of God. We need to not be led by our fleshly lusts, what we want ourselves, but we need to be led by the Spirit to grow with Jesus and to be guided by Him. And that's when we truly reflect the image of God. When we are so closely united with Him, we act like Him. How did He act? He put self aside and came down to be with us, to die for you and for I. That's how He rules His kingdom. That's how we should rule our kingdoms. And in verse 16 and 17 it says, the Spirit Himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs according to that promise. If we're children, we've got an inheritance. That's good news, isn't it? That's very good news. I was told the other week that I was getting cut out of the inheritance and my kids were going to get it all from my mother-in-law. I think that's how I understood it, I'm not sure. But you know, in the scheme of things, does it really matter? Because we have a greater inheritance. We have this greater inheritance because we become children of God. I love how Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians. I think you can probably preach 10 sermons on 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It's such an in-depth chapter. I just want to touch on a couple of places in 1 Corinthians to wrap this all up. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 20 it tells us, verse 20 of chapter 15, but now Christ is risen from the dead and is become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since by man came death, by man also comes the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all shall be made alive. Paul here is telling us that because Christ has risen from the dead, He's become the first fruits. The first fruits, what's the first fruits? It's the most important fruit. When you get the first fruits come in, you're going to have many more fruits after that. What he's saying is He's the first true Son of God that fulfilled the covenant. And now because of that, there's many more that can become sons and daughters of God. So this first fruits idea is just the fact that saying He did it for us so that now we can become His children. He goes on to explain more in verse 45. So it is written, the first Adam became a living being, the last Adam became a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, in other words, the fleshly, after the spiritual. The first man was on the earth, made of dust. The second man is of the Lord from heaven. You know what many people miss when we're actually made from the dust? We're made from nothingness. We're made from the elements of the earth, yes, but we're made from something that is dead. And then God breathed into our nostrils the breath of life. When it says the serpent is going to go on his belly for the rest of his life and eat dust for all his life, it's telling us that he's going to be heading towards death all of his life. So when Paul here is saying the first Adam was made from dust, the second one is from heaven. Adam was originally made from heaven, but he had to return to the dust. Let's go down to 48 and 49. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are made of dust. And as is the heavenly man, so also are those who are heavenly. And as we have borne the image of man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly man. So what it's telling us here, that we can have a transformation. We can come back from what we were to who we were designed to be. So Jesus is therefore now this son whom many sons can be born from. Not in a chronological sense. He is the true Son of God that restores our image back to the image of God. You know, that's our vision for Lismore Church this year. That's our vision for every single member here today. Even those who aren't here, and for those who are watching on YouTube. This is God's vision for you. That you stop being sons of man and become sons of God. Because sons of God reflect the image of who God is. Sons of God act like sons of God. How does that happen? Let's make this really practical, make this really easy. Because in 1 John 5 and verse 13, he says, "These things I've written to you who believe in the name of the Son of God." So what it's telling us, we have to have a belief that Jesus, this name of Jesus as the Son of God, is that he is the one who fulfilled his promise way back in Genesis 3. He is the one who was to come. He is the one who was going to restore our position back to what it was meant to be in the original. We must have a belief that he can restore you and I here today. What's the key to that restoration process? I believe the key to that restoration process was found in that one word. United together with him, planted together with him. How do we say that again, Emily? You're not sure, you've forgotten it too. That Greek word that tells us that we need to die to self. We need to be planted with Jesus, to be intertwined with him as we grow. And the more that happens, the more that we will be the true sons and daughters of God that God always intended us to be. You know, one thing that I do when I study with people, I want to be able to transition them from having that one study a week to having daily time with God, intertwining with him, growing with him, because when that happens, the devil will flee from you. And you won't live according to the fleshly desires of self. You'll live according to the desire that God has for us. To be his representatives. To be the ones that see somebody in need and go straight to them. That when somebody hurts you, don't go and make a big song and dance about how bad they are. Just go about how you can make it even better. Work on what you can do rather than what others can do. You know, Jesus has shown us that he is desperate to have us united with him. Jesus has shown us that he is desperate for us to be called sons of God. That's why he left the courts of heaven. That's why he was born as a human being. He could only fight this battle in human flesh. He could only defeat the devil from our turf because he gave that dominion to Adam. The only way he could win that back was coming through the seed of Adam and restoring that for us. He showed how desperate he is to have us as sons and daughters of God, to reflect his image to others, and now he's inviting us. He's inviting you to be his son and daughter. we're going to play our, are we going to sing our final song? We're going to play our final song, and I want you to listen to the words. The reason why I chose this song was not because of its beat or because of any other reason but the words. Less of me and more of God. Because less of me is less of self, of this fleshly nature, and more of God. And when God dwells in us, we become the true sons of God.